it's really an honor for me to be part of that endeavor and to have that presentation. And maybe you allow me a few words before I dive into what I want to present, because I was hesitant a bit about, how can I present what we are doing and how does that really matters to the audience? Because this is first and foremost, this is an mainly German, maybe Western European perspective on what is going on in education for sustainable development at higher education institutions. And I mean, this is a long-going endeavor we have, and I think it's a much needed transformation of the educational system. But obviously, it does not fully take into account the tremendous changes we are seeing since that terrible war Russia started. And I only, I only feel sort of confident and that it's the right thing to continue the discussion and to bring that discussion in with our colleagues from the Ukraine. At Eberswalde University, we have a long-standing collaboration with different universities in the Ukraine, and we are working for the past 15 plus years together on projects on sustainability education. We build materials together, we educated educators together, and we have an ongoing exchange. And that exchange did not stop with what happened in the Ukraine the last couple of years. And this is something I'm very, I feel quite relieved of, and I feel honored by. And this gives me sort of the rationale why we keep the discussion open and going about education for sustainable development. So when I'm talking about future-proofing higher education in times of polycrisis, it is really the role of higher education for sustainable development, which I'm concerned of. At our university, a university that sort of put sustainable development at heart in its vision and mission, it's really something that drives us. We want to be enabler of change. And so we are thinking deeply and hard about how higher education can contribute to sustainable development. And I want to do that in 5 steps in my short presentation, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion between us. So I want to quickly talk about sustainability, the challenge and the mission that is involved in that. I want to then draw attention to what that means in terms of higher education, so how sustainability plays a role in higher education. I then want to dig a bit more into sustainability in teaching and learning before I move on to what that actually means in sort of a roundup on future-proofing higher education. And I want to introduce the idea of living labs and higher education institutions as living labs, which I think is important. But let's start with sustainability, just as a quick overview. And I know that you all, sort of have the basic understanding of what that is about. So I want to do that just very quickly. One of the first important things for me is, we know that we are on a path of unsustainable development. And this is nothing new. We know that already quite for a while. Probably since the Limits to Growth report that already came out in the 1970s, we know about the challenges of an unsustainable development, but still we are on that path that was sort of predicted in terms of coming to a collapse since then. So this is something really challenging. But also sustainable development as a concept evolved since then. And I quite like this figure when we talk about what sustainable development is. Because for me, as for my colleague Kate Rawolf, who came up with that figure, sustainable development happens within or needs to happen within safe and just boundaries. It is something in the interplay of outer planetary boundaries. We have to respect the planetary boundaries, but it's not only about planetary boundaries. Sustainable development at heart really is a concept of justice. And therefore, we do have sort of minimum requirements, which are these inner boundaries. Requirements we want to see fulfilled for each and everybody, everywhere, now and in the future, which means, the availability of health, of food, of water, of education, also obviously of peace and justice. So these are all inner boundaries. And when we are bringing these planetary outer boundaries and these inner boundaries together, then we see a space in which sustainable development can happen. And this is an open space. It's not just like one way that leads us to sustainable development. There are different pathways, but they are all happening in between these borders. And based on the discussion of sustainable development, and I just realized the mishap that I put a German figure in here, but I think you do all know the pictures and the pics here, which are about the sustainable development goals. So this is how we came to operationalize the idea of sustainability, and that really brought us to a better understanding of what sustainability is actually about. But what I also want to point out, and which David Orr really quite vividly pointed out, is that when we talk about sustainability, we often talk about the need of education. But it's not just a more of education, because David Orr pointed out that these current social and ecological trends are not the work of ignorant people. It's not the problem that these are people who has too little education. It's rather, the result of work by people with high education. So this brings us to the point that it obviously is not just about having more education, but to reframe what sort of education do we actually need. And another colleague of mine, Arjen Walls, pointed that very nicely out when he talks about learning. He says that it's not so much about learning about sustainability. It's more about unlearning unsustainability. So this is how he points out that we really need a different understanding of learning and education. And that brings me to sustainability in higher education. What does that actually mean, and where is it of relevance in higher education? And when we talk about higher education, we have these different niches and boxes. We talk about teaching and learning, we talk about research, we talk about third mission, dissemination of knowledge, but also the inner institution and admin. And sustainability is something that cuts across all these different spheres. It needs to be foreseen and it needs to be respected in all four areas. And we increasingly see that. We see strong networks around the globe who are, where they bring together like-minded institutions. And we also see that sort of in the more traditional higher education system, and I take here the Times Higher Education World University rankings, even in these sort of high impact rankings, they nowadays recognize the need to respond to sustainability. So even Times Higher Education now has an impact ranking on sustainability and takes that into account because they realize that in terms of accountability of institutions, that is also something very important. So for me, if we think about the different expectations on higher education institutions, there are at least three sort of entrance points where sustainability and thinking about sustainability can really help. One is the social responsibility that higher education institutions, as highly funded institutions, which are about educating the next generation of leaders and change makers, have that social responsibility and also and those need to take sustainability into account. Then we see at higher education institutions an increasingly in diversity and an internationalization. And sustainability can be sort of an, an focus point which structures the discussion and the collaboration across different cultures and different nations and is a sort of a shared anchor and discussion point. And then we see in higher education increasingly the need that the need is pointed out for interdisciplinarity. And sustainability is a fine example of something of a complex challenge, complex problems where interdisciplinarity is needed. So it's really a blueprint of, for what sort of challenges and problems interdisciplinarity can come into play. So if we now go even a bit further and think about how does sustainability can be reflected in teaching and learning, and what does it mean to bring sustainability in higher education, teaching and learning, then I distinguish here between the micro and the macro level. The micro level, which is more about the learning in classroom, how we interact with our students, and the macro level of how we change or implement, change study programs or implement new study programs. And if we start with that micro level, we basically start with our students. And I just introduced two of my freshman students here. And for me, higher education for sustainable development really is about educating future change agents. And if we do that, we have to think about what do we want to educate them for? And in the sort of general discussion, there are basically three different concepts that are reiterated. The first is expertise. Obviously, in higher education at universities, we want to enable them to gain expertise in the subject, in the discipline they are studying. That is without question. But even more than expertise, it's also about employability. And employability is not just knowledge and expertise, it's also the question of in an ever faster changing world, what sort of competencies do they need in a future which is, AI involved, which is, more and more in a digital world, fast changing with new professions coming up and so on. So this is about employability. But there also, and I can't let stress out enough, there's also a third concept, and that is about citizenship. We educate also with a sort of a moral compass, with sort of basic values. We need to enable students to reflect on these basic values and to create a responsible global citizenship for them. And if we take that into account, then the question is, how do we create learning environments that enable all these three aspects, and how do they enable us to educate future change agents? And for me, that is sort of that triangle of learning outcomes, the question of what do we want them to gain? What are the learning outcomes we expect? What is the content with which we can foster these learning outcomes? And what are the pedagogies that help to build these competencies, these learning outcomes we are expecting? And with higher education for sustainable development, especially in these pedagogies, there really is a shift from teaching to learning, a shift from sort of instillment of knowledge to competence development. Competence development where problem solution oriented learning, collaborative learning, self-directed learning is important. And that really is a paradigm shift for me, which us as teachers, brings in a different position, more of moderators and managers of learning journeys, of learning pathways, rather than experts who sort of transfer just some knowledge. And I think that is very important on that micro level of teaching and learning. But there is also more. There's also the macro level, which asks, how can we instill sustainability in different disciplines, in different study programs, and how can we make sustainability count in teaching and learning across the board at universities? And there, over the last 20 years, we gained a lot of knowledge in how that can happen, what the main drivers and barriers are, what patterns of such implementations look like, and what ways of implementations we might have. So a first sort of strand of research really looked into the steps of implementing sustainability in universities, starting by just the inclusion of the topic to introducing new learning approaches, step by step to integrating really into existing curricula the question of competence development, to enable young students to become future change agents. We also see and understand now better different ways of implementation. How can we bring sustainability in the study programs? And we distinguish basically three such pathways. We see around the globe a lot of what I call major sustainability study programs that are dedicated explicitly to sustainability and try to educate sustainability experts. But we also see equally important what I call minor sustainability. This is combining existing study programs with a perspective on sustainability. So combining the more traditional economics, for example, with sustainability management perspective, or combining tourism and marketing study programs with sustainability, and through that really getting a new idea and a new perspective on existing study programs. And the third approach really is more of a built-in approach where no new programs come in, but sustainability is seen as something that is very core and very basic and needs to be woven into existing study programs as a sort of a study generale, fundamental study program, so that each and every student who goes through a university gets involved with thinking critically about sustainability. And for these different sort of implementation pathways, we also see patterns of implementations. And with a couple of hundred of examples around the globe by now, we also have empirical evidence of what are drivers that are important to implement sustainability in universities, what are the drivers of success, and what are barriers, and what are strategies, to use the drivers and to overcome the barriers. This is a quite vivid field of research over the last years where we really can learn from each other and can inform each other on successful pathways. What is also important when it comes to teaching and learning is that sort of next practices. And here I would argue that sustainability education really can be a driver of innovation for teaching and learning at universities. Because these are three fundamental needs or quests which we see increasingly around the globe that is brought towards higher education. There is a need for interdisciplinary learning opportunities. There is a quest for intercultural learning, and there is also an increasingly the call for engagement of universities in the community. And sustainability education, I would argue, brings fine examples and blueprints of how that can be done by introducing sustainability into teaching and learning. Because if you introduce sustainability into teaching and learning, you will need interdisciplinary perspectives. You will need to have intercultural exchange and conversations. And you will need to go out of the university to engage in the community. So this really could be a sort of a booster for teaching and learning in universities to innovate what they are doing and to bring it to the next level. So what does that mean for future-proofing higher education when we introduce sustainability? And I want to basically quickly talk about two concepts which I think are very telling and helpful here. The first is for me that idea of transformability. An ability that means, which is sort of an back and forth between the ability to bring change, which brings us to the question of, how can we enable students to bring change? But on the other hand, also more inward looking, the ability to change as oneself, as a learner. So what do we need to do in terms of critical reflection and reflection opportunities for students to also give them the ability to change? Now, that is the idea of transformability as a concept. And I think these two sides of a coin are very telling here. And the other sort of counterparts are around transformation. And that is what when it comes to research, we need research on transformation. We need to understand how we can transform, a society, an institution towards sustainability. But we don't need only research on transformation, sort of from the outside observing and empirically gaining evidence. We also need transformative research, research that is more action-oriented and already brings change, and at the same time researches the change it is bringing. And I think at universities, we need to sort of balance between these two poles of research on transformation and transformative research to really make a difference. And that brings me to my last point of the role of higher education institutions. I understand, and in the European context within the EU, for example, in many projects, that is increasingly picked up that concept of higher education institutions as living labs, as sort of a real world laboratory where we can experiment with change and where we can learn in our own doing. And that is also coming out of two aspects that are highly interwoven. That is one, the accountability. As higher education institutions, highly state funded, we are accountable for really also being a fine example and blueprint of how change could look like and how an sustainable institution can work. And on the other side, it's really our chance to work as a learning organization. We are learning while we are doing change. We are learning while we are changing our institutions, and through changing our institutions, also changing our surrounding. And this is the living lab idea, so that we really are some sort of a laboratory where we can experiment with new approaches, new ideas, but we also need to do research on to learn from these new ideas, and where we need to exchange, which brings us again to the need of an intercultural and international collaboration to have the best chance to learn together and from each other. So if I try to summarize, I want to point out at least maybe three aspects as food for thought also for an ongoing discussion. 3 points I want to point out with my presentation. One is sustainability. I hope I was able to show really can be, should be, and need to be an innovator in teaching and learning. It can help, to increase the effectiveness, but also, the creativity of teaching and learning and bringing it to a next level. It also, focusing on sustainability, helps to focus on problem solution oriented research and dissemination, something that is needed in many different fields, and that can be fostered by the focus on sustainability. And last but not least, sustainability is sort of a framework and an orientation for organizational development as such. If we want to learn to become better institutions, sustainability really can give us a framework for that as well. And with these 3 last remarks, I want to end here, and thanks for your patience in the audience. Thank you very much.